Chapter 6, The Obvious Turned Obscene. Natural law is always superior to man-made laws and executive mandates. Laws in opposition to natural law are innately the immoral ones. The United States was founded upon this notion. The reality of the superiority of natural law was codified in the formation of our government, documented in the Declaration of Independence, and was thus recognized by the majority of Americans for what seemed like at least 240 years. Because Americans have been blessed to live in a country where the governing contract does recognize natural law, human rights, and individual liberties, and because we do know it when we see it, it has been fairly easy to point out violations of the social contract and violations against natural law. Until recently. Because legitimate government exists to preserve the natural order, to protect its people from those who would violate natural rights based on natural law, it is imperative to have self-evident truths everyone agrees upon, including self-evident and inherent rights. But what if we no longer agree on what is right and good? I think that's where we find ourselves today. And coming up, I'm going to use some examples that I could reference and footnote, but please pay attention to the concepts, not what you want to be true, not what side you are on at the moment, but how documented reality aligns or fails to align with this principle of natural law and natural liberty. Okay. When a person or a group of people gathers to protest against coercion, they are not only advocating for freedom, an inherent right based on natural law, but fulfilling their obligation as citizens under the Lockean social contract, holding government accountable for abdicating their responsibility. And if this is done without taking away anyone else's freedom, which peaceful protests never should, this is an innate and thus legally protected right. Yet, when Michiganders protested the 2020 lockdowns, masked up, socially distanced, and not obstructing any traffic, the government cracked down even harder, and someone on CNN actually called freedom the problem. And for months, any similar peaceful protest was framed by politicians and the media alike as thoughtless, hateful, and dangerous, all while these same people were inflaming, even calling for, violent riots across the country to protest injustice. We know it when we see it was turned on its head. Not only was there destruction of private property and looting, but business owners feared for their lives, ended up in the hospital, and some people trying to protect the innocent even ended up murdered. All these activities were praised as good. Criminals became heroes, and those whose job it is to preserve order became the enemy. And this was all based upon what we wanted to be virtuous, so we could be on the winning side. We were living as though virtue and truth was decided based on the feelings and opinions of the loudest voices, the perceived majority. We were living in a democracy, and we felt the desperation to be on the winning team, not just so we could have the perceived authority to tell those who disagreed with us that they were wrong and we were right, but so that our moral code and values would align with the narrative of virtue, and we would be free to have our own opinion. We were living in a de facto democracy with all the evils that come along with that. Over the past few years, freedom of speech has been replaced by laws and policies against disinformation and misinformation. Not just warnings on Facebook posts or suspending users from social media accounts, but there was the creation by the Biden White House of the Disinformation Governance Board, which thankfully was paused after being panned as the Ministry of Truth from Orwell's dystopian novel 1984. California AB 2098, though, was not shot down. And instead, the bill whose purpose is to target speech that does not fit the official narrative, AB 2098, was signed into law by Governor Newsom, which when coupled with AB 587, is a dangerous step toward government censorship on all Californian platforms. And now, even, there's a push to have the World Health Organization decide what is reliable information and what is misinformation and disinformation, not just for California, but for the entire world. Handing over our freedom of speech to an extra national agency should be egregious for any nation. But for a country that enshrined these natural rights into our governing documents and has lived accordingly for hundreds of years, this seems especially obscene. And the fact that we're even thinking about it, and some of us are advocating for it, this is another thread pulled from the fabric. It is one of those threads that holds the rest of the tapestry together. And I'm baffled by the desire to pursue these ends. Truly baffled. Anyway, then came the argument that if someone did not voluntarily give up their bodily autonomy and freedom of conscience, they should have their rights forcibly removed from them. They did not deserve rights because somehow not getting a vaccine or not wearing a mask means that person is a murderer and murderers should not have any rights. Non-actions based on free thought and critical thinking regarding individual responsibility were equated to intentional actions of violence of the worst kind. Again, what is natural law, what should be natural, the right to life, the right to property, the right to pursue your happiness, the right to equality, the right to just participate in society, was denied or was attacked and equated with criminality and violence. And yes, this is another nod to the idea that we truly believe we now live in a democracy. And yes, perception does become reality. Then came the subsequent argument that no one has the right or should have the freedom to break the law. So, how can one reconcile the right to peacefully assemble and the right to petition the government, liberties recognized in the U.S. Constitution, with the idea that these gatherings are against the law? And remember, the supreme law of the land is the U.S. Constitution, not an executive mandate. Again, natural law is morally superior to man-made law. The reality is that if the government breaks the contract and creates and enforces laws in conflict with the natural law and natural rights they are sworn in the United States to protect, one is obligated to protest the breaking of the contract. And should they do this peaceably, the people are in the right and the government is the party at fault because the law or the mandate is unjust. What about those Canadian truckers who blocked roadways and hurt the economy? Well, that was kind of the point of the protest, and thus actually the moral move. Given the situation, that was the only logical protest. Those truckers move goods. They supply the economy. That was the point. They were trying to point out the obvious. They were relying on obvious natural law and the fact that the Canadian government was violating the social contract. The written version of the contract in Canada may not be as solidly written as the U.S. Constitution, but that matters not at all. There have been, not just recently, but throughout the modern age, similar protests in countries without written contracts recognizing natural rights and the role of government, like Lebanon or Egypt or Cuba or China, which now includes Hong Kong. Yet morally, even though rights are not codified or protected in writing, those protests are still valid because natural law is always superior to man-made law, even in places that don't recognize natural law. Laws in opposition to natural law are innately the immoral ones. We have been blessed to live in a country where the governing contract does recognize natural law, human rights, and individual liberties, which means it should be easy to recognize an obvious violation of the contract. However, it now appears that American priorities and values have shifted because what was once obvious is instead seen as obscene.